Please welcome to the stage INSA Chief Operating Officer, Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here to kick off the second part of today's program. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Jonathan McDonald, Executive Vice President of TransUnion's Public Sector Business, who will introduce our lunch keynote. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I really appreciate the introduction. First of all, TransUnion's pleased to sponsor this keynote lunch speaking event. So we really appreciate the opportunity, Suzanne and Chuck. Some people are wondering why TransUnion's here, what we have to do with cyber. So I want to just take just a quick couple seconds to explain that. TransUnion's in the people business, as many of you guys know. And we have over 1 billion people in our systems, some of which is heavily regulated and highly secure. What you might not know is that we have over 6 billion devices, and that number grows daily. Now, when you associate devices with people, who those people might work for in the supply chain, we have some very interesting insights that contribute to cyber and national security related initiatives. Now, to that end, I want to thank INSA for putting together these events where you actually bring private and public sector together. We wouldn't be where we are without your partnership. I just want to thank you both. Thank you very much. So please join me in thanking INSA. If you give them a round of applause for today's event. And now I'll make an introduction to Amy Hess. I apologize, I'm going to have to read this because I couldn't memorize your 28-year history there. Amy is the Executive Assistant Director of the FBI's Criminal, Cyber, Response, and Services Branch. In this position, she oversees all FBI criminal and cyber investigations worldwide, international operations, critical incident response, and victim assistance. Over her 28-year career in the FBI, Amy contributed to counterterrorism operations and led the agency's inspection, international operations, operational technology, and science and technology divisions. Amy will be joined on stage by INSA Vice President for Policy, Larry Hanauer, who will engage Amy in a moderated Q&A. So Larry, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just great, glad you can hear me. So again, I'm Larry Hanauer, Vice President for Policy at INSA. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And of course, I'm here with Amy Hess from the FBI. We'll spend about 30 minutes or so just having a discussion on stage. Then we'll open the floor up to questions for another 15 minutes or so while you're eating. And then we'll take a short break before moving into the next discussion. So Amy, you've had a lot of national security experience, criminal experience, as the introduction said, but we're really interested in your perspectives today as the senior-most FBI official responsible for the FBI's cyber efforts. So just to start out, it's hard to know where to start with cyber threats because it affects government agencies, companies, individuals. So what are the FBI's sense of the top cyber threats and your top cyber priorities? And since we have a largely industry crowd here, to what extent does industry, private sector perspectives factor into your prioritization?
Right. Well, thanks, Larry, and thanks to INSA, and thank you all for giving me this opportunity to be here and talk about these things today. For starters, I would say something that's not, or should not be, a surprise to any of you, which is that the cyber threat landscape is continually evolving. So we, of course, see a range of actors, whether they're nation states, non-nation states, hacktivists, criminal syndicates, insider threats, and others, using a whole variety and range of tools and capabilities. Of course, botnets or ransomware or business email compromise, spear phishing, whatever it may be, we're seeing continual adaptation of those tools, those capabilities, and directing those things toward whatever the goal is, whether it's for profit or whether it's to steal information or whether it's to steal national secrets, national security secrets. And where the private sector comes in, of course, as we continuously see, for example, 95% of the country's infrastructure is controlled or in the hands of the private sector. And that's significant. The things that these individuals are after are highly sought after and controlled, owned by private industry. And we have to develop those relationships from a government perspective with private sector to ensure that, for number one, for starters, that we're notified when an incident happens. Because the sooner we can get involved, the sooner we can identify who it is, the sooner we can identify their TTPs, and the sooner we can stop them, hopefully, from doing it again.
Right. Now, I know there's a new government agency that was recently established, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS. Their role is similar. So how do you define the lanes in the road on these kinds of activities with them? What does the Bureau do, and what does CISA do?
Sure, and we of course, work very closely with DHS and with the CISA in particular. What we see is, under the PPD 41 construct, is the response to a cyber incident. The FBI is the lead agency for the threat response. DHS is, of course, the lead agency for the asset response. And ODNI is responsible and has the lead for the intel support. But what that essentially boils down to, and what that means, is while CISA is identifying ways that the company, the victim, can protect themselves, how they can improve their capabilities in order, from a defensive posture, to ensure it doesn't happen again, or to ensure that they are secured against the next threat. What the FBI is doing in the meantime under the Department of Justice is trying to identify who did it, what are the techniques, tactics, and procedures they're using to identify who it comes back to. Is this a criminal syndicate? Is this a nation state? Who did it? And then ultimately to hold them accountable so that we can either bring them to justice or to reveal their identities and essentially make life difficult.
So it sounds like the Bureau would use some of the information that you have to inform CISA's understanding of the threats. So CISA can work with companies to bolster their defenses, and then if a company has an incident, they call 911 and they call the Bureau, basically.
Absolutely. It's a whole government approach. I mean, we all got to be working together. ODNI with the Intel support lead, we're all in that job, all in that role. Right. And we all have to work together in order to make it happen.
Right, that's great. I think the Bureau director recently said, if I remember correctly, that cybersecurity is a whole of nation problem with a whole nation, that requires a whole nation response. So that's a great example of how that is. Sure. So with the Bureau shifting more and more toward cybersecurity nowadays, given these threats, the shift really represents the third reinvention of the Bureau in the last generation or so, right? In the 1980s and 90s, the focus was on organized crime, counter-narcotics, violent crime. Then, of course, after the September 11th attacks, the Bureau's focus shifted to counterterrorism. And now here we are in the 2010s, shifting again to cybersecurity. So how is the FBI implementing the strategic shift? I mean, as an organization, how do you refocus sort of move a battleship, right? Turn a battleship on a dime, in terms of strategy and resources and capabilities?
Yeah, good question. So clearly, organizations to be successful, no matter who you are, have to adapt and evolve. And I'll use myself as an example. In the 90s, when I joined the FBI, is that it was all about drugs and drug trafficking and gangs and criminal enterprises. And that's what I worked. That was what I did in my first office assignment as an agent in the Kansas City, Missouri field office. That's what I worked. And then by the time I had moved to my second office and 9/11 happened, all of a sudden, many of us who had grown up in a world investigating or prioritizing drug trafficking organizations now were shifted to work counterterrorism. And so our workforce must adapt to that evolving threat, what that priority is, what's important to our nation in order to combat it, in order to identify who's behind it and responsible. And then, of course, as you pointed out, over time, we have become a society that is inherently reliant upon technology. And this is the world we live in. It's also the world that criminals and spies and others live in. And we've got to be able to adapt to that. But that's a little probably easier said than done when it comes to developing the technical capabilities of an entire workforce. That's not going to happen overnight. So what types of things we're doing is identifying, for example, for starters, essentially, what is your baseline? What is the baseline of the employees we have working for us as far as if they don't come with a technical degree? Well, we've trained a whole bunch of people to investigate or to conduct analysis or to do other things. How can they adapt those skills to be able to address the cyber threat? In addition to that, how are we identifying the people that we want to recruit into the organization? And of course, it's a very competitive field, and there's no way that the US government's going to be able to compete based on salary with private sector. So what do we have to make it an appealing opportunity? That goes back to mission. Right. Some of the most sophisticated cyber actors that you will ever encounter are the ones that we are going after. And hopefully the cool factor wins out when it comes to our ability to recruit people with those technical skills and backgrounds to work for us.
The cool factor, I think, has a definite pull, but stock options have a strong appeal too, right, for a lot of people. So let's pull that thread a little bit. What does the Bureau need to do differently, if anything, to be able to recruit, hire, train, and retain people with the technical skills in cybersecurity and other computer savvy kinds of backgrounds, so that the cool factor isn't the only thing that draws them in, right? Do you need new authorities? Do you need new pay scales or incentives? Or how do you bring those people in and then keep them once they're there?
And my opinion is everything should be on the table for us to look at. However, in recognizing the structure that we currently operate under, that may take some time. So in the meantime, what short-term gains can we have? There's a recent initiative that was just implemented not too long ago, the Cyber Talent Initiative, which is essentially working with 11 different federal agencies and certain companies, Microsoft, MasterCard, Workday, I think there's a few others that are involved in this, where they just rolled this out to say, if you go to work for this federal agency for 2 years, then you will be eligible to gain a private sector position in one of these companies, and we will pay up to $75,000 toward your student loans. Wow. And so that's a pretty good incentive. In addition to what the FBI can provide, for example, and many other government agencies, things like student loan repayment programs or university education programs where we can pay for all of or most of an advanced degree. Also retention bonuses, looking at things like that where we have these super highly skilled individuals who may be tempted at perhaps the 5, 6, 10-year mark to look for other opportunities. If we can provide them with a little incentive to stick around, then we get to gain that advantage.
Are there tools or even obstacles to, because there's always the risk that you lose those people in mid-career, they go find an opportunity in the private sector. What about the chances that they could go find an opportunity in the private sector, sort of the reverse of what you were describing, where they leave the Bureau, they go to a private company for 2 years, 3 years, and then come back to the Bureau armed with that private sector experience? Are there programs in place for that, or would they have to leave, go to the company, and then maybe go through the whole security clearance process again, which, as a lot of people in this room know, is not an easy process? Yeah.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point, is that I think that part of the way I look at it is, should that not be okay? You know, in government, in U.S. government over history, we tend to, I kind of jokingly refer to it as you come into the federal government and you can die here 50 years later. And rather than using that model, maybe we should be okay with you come to work for us for a couple of years, you go to work for, obviously it'd be great if it was a cleared contractor so that you could retain that clearance, and then you come back to work actually with us. And to that point, we've actually recently seen several people who have left us, cyber employees who have left us, who have come back to us. And so that's heartening to think that perhaps this work, the fulfillment that they get from this work, is what's pulling them back.
So maybe the stock options aren't as appealing as they might sound.
Depends on the person, I suppose.
Let's talk about some of the cyber threats that the country faces and the Bureau's role in them. So the intelligence community concluded that Russia attempted to affect the presidential election in 2016. Does the Bureau believe that Russia or others will use cyber tools in the upcoming elections? And if so, what kind of meddling are we likely to see, and what would the Bureau's role be in countering that?
Well, I think first off is I think just a couple weeks ago, we sent out a joint intelligence bulletin with DHS that talked about this issue and talked about how we assess that it's very likely that they will continue to do this type of activity based on what we saw from the 2016 elections, and just the reconnaissance alone. The research, we can even show that it included about 40 states. So why would we not think, it would be the better way, I think, to phrase that, why would we not think that they would continue to do that? And to that point, we need to be prepared. Whether it's Russia or anybody, we need to be prepared for that. And one of the things that the FBI did was in 2017 establish the Foreign Influence Task Force.
Right.
So that brought in individuals, people with certain skill sets in different areas. The counterintelligence, certainly, that piece, those people, the cyber piece. Also, though, are criminal investigators who are responsible for interference with elections, things that we would normally criminally prosecute somebody for. And then even our counterterrorism individuals, bringing them together so that they can look at the problem holistically. And so that FITF, that Foreign Influence Task Force, has been in existence since 2017, and it has not stopped to look at the problem as it continues through to the 2020 elections.
And based on what you've seen and analyzed to date, do you feel like the Bureau has a good handle on what we might see in the future?
I always caution to think that, yeah, we got this, because I think we should never be comfortable with our level of knowledge and understanding of the threat. I think that we have a good understanding of today's threat, but as you know, technology changes on a dime, and as the cyber threat evolves, it does too. And we've got to constantly be ready for that, and we constantly see changes in that threat landscape.
Right. Let me ask a question about China as well, and sort of data, threats to data and privacy. So China allegedly has used cyber attacks to vacuum up enormous amounts of data, such as the OPM hack, which affected 22 million cleared Americans, hacks on Marriott hotels, which happens to be the top hotel provider for the American government and American military, which affected more than 300 million people worldwide, presumably a lot of non-Americans as well, health insurance companies, and countless others. So presumably whoever stole this data is going to use it in some way for some future electronic attack or to target people for some reason using that information. So what is most concerning to you about the loss of this data? And does the FBI have a sense of what the hackers are likely to do with it? And maybe with that we should start, can we say that China is behind this, or is that not the official narrative?
I would say that before we identify a clear attribution, I want to talk about the China threat a little bit. And so clearly, China wants to be the world's leading superpower. To do that, our concern is they may go about doing that by stealing other people's information. And they have. And we've identified that. Nation-state actors for the People's Republic of China have stolen information from U.S. businesses, U.S. government, and related sectors. And so, as a matter of fact, last year we indicted two Ministry of State Security actors for doing just that and accessing over 45, I think, different technology companies and government entities to do that. And that's where we've got to constantly be looking for that type of activity, that type of behavior, whether they're stealing it in a cyber sense or whether they're stealing actual physical property, whether they're legitimately buying U.S. companies or providing a service that seems to be a pretty good investment because it's perhaps the lowest of the bids that are out there. That's potentially concerning because once you get into the supply chain, it may be a very difficult proposition to extract ourselves from that. And in China, of course, the government has a heavy influence over Chinese companies. And our really discussion should be centered around how do we feel about that? Are we okay with the level of risk that poses for our national and economic security? And so we are constantly working to attribute activities, but sometimes, and this is why, of course, many instances, the first question people will ask is, of course, who did it? What's the attribution? We got to be pretty clear before the FBI comes out on record and says, this is who did it.
Right.
Now, clearly, we work toward that goal as quickly as possible. And once we do that and can hold them accountable, you've seen a series of public announcements, indictments, arrests, extraditions in the past.
Now, since you mentioned various kinds of cyber attacks on companies, a lot of companies are uncomfortable coming forward when they've been the victim of an attack for a variety of reasons. So government agencies perhaps as well, or don't come forward quite as quickly as they might. What can companies and government agencies do to prevent these kinds of thefts, and how can the Bureau work with them to do that?
Yeah, the first, I think our number one piece of advice would be to have an incident response plan, to practice it, to make sure that your company knows what to do in the event of such an incident. And number two, and probably a very close second, if not tied, is to notify us. But I understand, and of course the mindset has been in the past that, hey, wait a second, that brings risk to me because now I'm exposed.
Right.
And what are you going to do with that information? So we have done a lot, I think, I know, in the past several years to engage the private sector. So the FBI has 56 different field offices and about 350 satellite offices outside of that in the country. And each one of those have a directive to engage private sector, to identify who are the most likely targets of such activity, and to identify how we can develop a relationship so that we have that trust, that confidence built up. It's kind of interesting is when you think about the way the FBI has gone about crisis events is we'll respond to a crisis event, and we always say, that is not the time to be meeting people, your local police chief or sheriff or commissioner for the first time.
Right.
Same thing should apply in a cyber incident, right? Is because when a cyber incident happens, that should not be the first time that we're meeting each other.
Right.
And so we have to develop that level of comfort, that level of interaction, and that level of trust in order to know that we're not going to then out you to the world to say, hey, this is what just happened to them. We do, of course, want to strive for two things. One, attribution, to try to figure out who did it and try to hold them accountable. And in the meantime, we also want to try to share that information out there, non-attributable, so that we can protect that information, but put it in such a way that other consumers can defend themselves.
Right. And would a company go to their local FBI field office? Would they work with an ISAC to share information that then eventually makes its way to the Bureau? What's the typical mechanism for a company to engage the Bureau when they have those kinds of incidents?
I think the most effective, and certainly for us, what we typically see is the local field office is right there in your backyard. I was most recently before this job, I was assigned as the agent in charge of our Louisville, Kentucky field office. There are multiple companies headquartered in Louisville, and we developed a relationship to where we would say, hey, we are a few miles down the road from your headquarters. And so anytime you want, we can come over here, and we did provide briefings, provide defensive briefings, or provide briefings where not only we're sharing information, they're sharing information. The CISO would tell us, this is the kind of activity we're seeing.
Right.
And that was informative for us so that we had an understanding, a better understanding also of their daily business, how they do things, what types of information would be attractive to either a nation-state actor or to a criminal enterprise.
Do you think that the C-suite leadership of a lot of companies understand those threats and understand what might be of interest? For example, at INSA, we have an Insider Threat Council, and as we've looked at sort of corporate assessments of the value of their insider threat program, there doesn't seem to be a universally accepted understanding at the C-suite level of how an insider threat could really affect their business. So the security people, the CISOs and the CIOs in a company certainly understand what's valuable and how it can be attacked. Do you think, do the corporate C-suite executives, the CEO, the COO, and others, CFO, do they understand as well? Because it's hard to put a value sometimes on something that hasn't happened or isn't happening yet.
Sure. Yeah. I would say that, and I don't want to generalize all companies, because some are really good at that.
Yep.
But you're right. I mean, it runs the gamut. There are some that don't have a good appreciation of that. It's interesting is that some of the companies that we'll engage with the C-suite, and we'll ask them to identify, this is what your 10K says, but what do you think are the threats? And of course, after they say, oh, well, cyber's the threat. Okay, and so what parts, and what exactly are you concerned about? where can we help? Where can the FBI be useful in providing you more information or sharing more information with you?
Right.
And very rarely will any of them identify an insider threat, which is interesting, I think, to me. They will identify external attacks, but very rarely will they identify one internally. And that would indicate they're not prepared for it,
right.
and are not taking any precautions for it. And so that's just one thing that we find an avenue to say, have you thought about X? And once we do that, we can work together, and they're really good about usually responding. Now, like I said, all companies are different. The size, their resources, their the amount of investment they can put into such types of defenses may vary.
Right. Let me ask one more question, and then we'll open the floor up to the audience. The Bureau, like all government agencies, relies to a fair extent on contractors to support it, to conduct some critical missions, to augment your in-house expertise. And we have a fairly industry-heavy audience here this morning. So how can industry best support the Bureau in its current work and its future work? And in what ways might the FBI's partnership with contractors change in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. First off, of course, the FBI, U.S. government as a whole, but the FBI works very closely with our contractor community on all aspects of all of the things that we see and the threats that we see. And this is no different. And certainly we need that expertise. We need those skills to be able to apply to the different problem sets. So that's not going to change in my view. And I think that necessarily we will need to be clear in what types of things that we see as the threat evolves,
right.
Because these are the types of skills that we need in order to address that threat, in order to address that problem. But I would say more broadly is for all of us to be on the same level when it comes to the intel sharing, understanding what the cyber threat is, how it's composed, the TTPs that are used, whether it's, again, nation states or criminal enterprises, or hacktivists or anyone that's out there. What are those types of threats? What do they look like? How are we sharing that information? How are we preparing for those things? The last thing, obviously, any of us wants is to have our information
right.
Stolen or compromised in some way. And especially those of us involved in the national security business, that is a grave concern to all of us, as it should be and is, I know, to many of our contractors that are out there. So we all need to be making sure that not only are we investigating these things, we also need to ensure that our own systems are secured.
And in terms of personnel, do you feel like, you were talking about the need to develop a cyber workforce internally, do you feel like the contractor or the industry sector has the in-house expertise to sort of augment your capabilities, or is that sort of an area for potentially growing partnership?
I think you always grow that piece. Is that generally speaking, I think the speaking for the FBI, we have a lot of indigenous capabilities and people and skilled workforce to begin with, but then that's augmented by very skilled and capable contractors. Right. But we can always change and get better. I recall in one of my last jobs is that I was responsible for telephone intercepts. We had an individual who had worked there for many years, and he brought up the analogy to say that I was raised understanding how to intercept a landline telephone on a rotary dial. He said, but if that's all I still did, he says, I would no longer be employed here. He says, we've got to adapt, we've got to learn what the new threat environment looks like, and I think we should always keep that in mind and
right.
challenge ourselves to do that.
Good point. I remember my first job out of college, there was in the office, there was a whole fax department. And there was someone who did nothing but send and receive faxes, and I think they probably moved on from that role by
Maybe.
now.
Let's hope.
Great. So with that, if anyone in the audience has any questions, happy to open up the floor. Yes, right here in the center, please. And please just identify yourself when you ask your question.
I'm Joel Scheckman from Reuters. I had a question. We see a lot of people who are trained in the U.S. intelligence field these days, particularly like with cyber offensive capabilities. You see a lot of them now going over to work as contractors afterwards. and often now as like contractors for foreign governments and even contractors for foreign intelligence services. And many of these are cleared individuals, and it's not clear that doing this is exactly against the law, but I wanted to ask you, what threats you've seen that poses, and what approach, if any, the Bureau has taken to address that issue.
Yeah. So I would say, first off, yes, of course it's of concern that what anyone learns about how the U.S. government works, and particularly when it comes to national security and our capabilities, then I think it should be of concern to all of us that then they might take that information and use it for nefarious purposes, use it against us, essentially, or sell that information to somebody else. And so that's certainly something that we're conscious of. And if we see that type of information, it's like when you receive your clearance, you of course are told that, hey, if you leave government service, that doesn't mean you get to take all this information and stuff with you. There are very strict rules and laws about those types of things. And so it is something we do and have investigated. And I unfortunately know that we will continue to investigate that. It depends on the level of severity it causes, the level, even if it's a for-profit type of ambition or goal that they might have. That's something that we would investigate. We would certainly want to hold those people accountable for taking that information and using it for nefarious purposes.
Great, thank you. Yes, right here in the front.
Connie, reporter from Voice of America. So the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI last week issued a report on Trojan malware variants linked to the North Korean government. How does the FBI assess the cyber threat coming from North Korea, and how serious is the threat to the U.S. national security?
Yeah, so clearly we are interested in the four primary nation-state actors we constantly see in the cyber threat landscape, and of course Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And so recently, last year, we identified an individual, a DPRK, a North Korean-sponsored actor, who was responsible for the Sony Pictures hack, the WannaCry ransomware, the I think it was the Bank of Bangladesh heist, and identifying who this individual is, just to put him out there, again, to expose this type of behavior and activity. It is one of the nation states that we're most concerned about because they have the level of capability to do such things and to be able to direct others to do such things on their behalf. So that doesn't stop. Now, I know there's been questions in the past about whether, which leads me to sort of a segue in a sense, that so what? You identify these individuals, you charge them, you indict them, but they're never gonna, they're never going to be arrested because they're never going to, get to a place where you can do that. And the way we view that is, I think that's the change of mindset that we have seen across not only the government, but particularly in the FBI, is that's okay. Because for one thing, when you think about it, what do hackers value more than anything? Their anonymity, right? Their freedom to do whatever they do. If we out them and we identify them, we just basically took away that thing of value to them. The other thing is, so now potentially limiting their travel, their options to go somewhere else. What if this is an individual who just graduated from college and they've got their whole life ahead of them, and now they realize that that vacation they were going to spend wherever, that's not going to happen anymore, or studying abroad is not a reality anymore. Is it worth it? And of course, if we can identify the country behind it for state-sponsored activity, then we have other options, sanctions, we have other types of things that we can do, and on top of all of that, can work with the service providers and the social media companies to shut it down, at least to shut down that type of activity. Or from a criminal enterprise perspective, we can redirect or seize the command and control servers. So it's causing some pain to have to reconstitute that infrastructure that we took out. So all of those things, they may not equate to the same thing as arrest and incarceration, but it's a pretty good pressure point, I think, that we have.
And so basically you're saying that you don't need to indict someone, bring them to a courtroom, and convict them of a cyber crime to hold people accountable for this kind of hacking.
Exactly. I think there are other ways that we can apply pressure and to be able to have a deterrent effect on future behavior.
Great. Other questions? Yes, in the back there by the window.
Thank you. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. There's a trend right now, at least in discussions, towards data localization on the national level, sometimes called data balkanization, where you have countries like Brazil, certainly Russia and other countries, coming up with new laws that say that if you're a foreign company like Google and you render service to our citizens, that data has to be housed in a database that's within the boundaries of our country. And I wonder, as the FBI looked at what that means potentially for future investigations, or what are your general thoughts on that?
Sure, it is something we're keenly interested in. The Cloud Act, the passage of the Cloud Act, earlier recently, and then also as we've seen with China and the relationship with Apple. We're interested in all examples of where that type of thing could be of concern to, and should be of concern to us. It brings up a lot of policy considerations as to how should we be thinking about that, because if we don't get access to the data, but yet another country does, another country that perhaps doesn't have the same rule of law, where we have to go, to a judge and get a warrant and have a series of checks and balances on our judicial processes. If that's not the case in another place where that data is housed and stored, then how do we think about that, and what should we do about it? We work a lot with our foreign partners, and a lot of people are interested and focused on this very issue, as well as what can be done about it from an international norm type of perspective. So I don't have an answer yet, but yes, it's of concern.
Great. Other questions? How about right here in the front?
Hi, Sean Lingus with Cyberscoop. I wanted to ask about the FBI's tackling of what it terms the encryption problem of circumventing encryption and encryption on devices. How much is the Bureau investing in those kinds of tools in its forthcoming budgets? And can you speak a little bit about what you learned from the aftermath of the San Bernardino episode when the FBI tried to access the shooter's phone? And obviously I don't need to rehash those details for you, you're familiar with that. But after that episode, how did that change the way you look at this problem or challenge of encryption for law enforcement?
The encryption challenge for law enforcement in particular, I think, and for any investigative entity, including national security, is challenging because on the one hand, we absolutely value encryption. We need protection of our systems, better protection of our systems, our data, our information across the board. But at the same time, the challenge for us is it's more and more difficult for us to see or have access to indicators of a crime or indicators of a threat. And that's concerning because what that means is we may not have the technical capability to access information. The question really is not for the FBI to say whether that's right or wrong. It's for the FBI to present, in my opinion, the facts so that we can say, look, it is affecting us. State and local police departments around the country will increasingly tell you that it is impacting their investigations, especially on the device itself, because they are seeing the inability to access that information. Now, with that said, we're having a lot of conversations with the private sector to identify, are there ways that we can securely access the information in some smart construct that we don't want to dictate, but perhaps the companies who built the technology, who know it better than anybody, can think of ways to build at least the most secure way of accessing that information, recognizing that, and just to lay it out there, is that any access point is going to present a vulnerability. But sometimes those access points already exist in the sense of, for example, password recovery, or the ability to scan for malware, or to scan for vulnerabilities in systems. Sometimes, perhaps, it's a matter of using what's already out there in order to get that information. But it's not for us to dictate that. My opinion is that's a conversation we need to have, though, because for society today, I mean, you think about, we live on our devices. Everything you do is more and more so on the device. And that's not just for people who are law-abiding citizens. Those are for the people who are doing really bad things out there, or trying to steal other people's information and get access to national security information. Terrorists who are trying to perpetrate an attack. That's concerning if we don't have access to that some way. And if it's totally reliant, if we're totally reliant on, for example, workarounds, or trying to identify or exploit a vulnerability, are we okay with that? Because that may take us, a lot of time to try to find what that vulnerability is. And in a short window, we have seen instances where the person says, I'm going to conduct this attack, or I'm going to kill this person. Well, did they mean now, today, or is that like 2 weeks from now? How much time do we have in order to find the vulnerability, in order to, if we even can? And it's at odds, though, as you rightfully point out, with our premise that we need to be as secure as possible, and we want people to be as secure as possible in the protection of their information and their data. So, so it is a very large question for us to answer in this forum. We could spend days probably on this topic. But the balance is, I think, something that is not for the U.S. government to decide. I think it's for all of us, the private sector, for the academics out there, for the research institutions, for all of us as a whole of society to think about how do we think about, is that okay? Are we okay living in a society where you can't access any of that? It doesn't matter whether you have a warrant signed by a judge and you can say that we think this person is going to do bad things. Is that okay? Are we okay in that world? And that's a larger policy question and discussion that I think we have had and are continuing to have.
I think in the interest of time, we'll probably stop there. We've provided some answers. We'll end with a question, I guess. But thank you very much for your insights on some really critical issues. We appreciate your explaining the Bureau's perspective and sharing your own expertise. So please join me in thanking Amy Hess for her time and insights.
Thank you, Amy and Larry. Before we take a break, I wanted to share an interesting data point today. You all may see a little bit of a difference in our logo over the past few weeks, and we're delighted to be celebrating the 40th anniversary of INSA. In recognition of that, I wanted to see if there's anyone here who was a member of INSA, let's say 25 years ago. If you'd stand up so we can recognize you. Tomorrow is actually the milestone of this anniversary, and as you know, we have a rich history fostering collaborative approaches to intelligence and national security priorities. From acquisition agility to cybersecurity to security clearance reform, INSA's played a pivotal role advancing public-private partnerships to solve some of the most pressing issues facing our industry. However, we couldn't have done this without the support of government, industry, and academia. So I'd like to thank everybody in the room for your support of our events, our councils, and most importantly, our mission. Later today, we'll be serving cake at our afternoon refreshment break, as you see here. And now we're going to take a quick 10-minute networking break. We'll regroup about 1:30. If you all can take a moment, just clear off your tables. There'll be some people helping to do that. And I'll be here to introduce our next panel. Thanks again.